So I actually had this video recorded last week, but I'm having to re-record the video again because there was this horrible wet mouth sound throughout the entire video. You know the kind that I'm talking about, where your mouth is like really dry. In fact, my mouth is still dry this morning, and I can still kind of hear it, which is driving me crazy. So I'm really hoping that it doesn't come through. I'm backing up a little bit more from the microphone, so hopefully you're not picking up every single spit and slobber sound coming, and that would just drive me crazy. I would turn off the video if I were you. So today's January 11th. A lot of things have happened since my last video. One of my dogs, Jax, passed away on December 6th, so I was pretty much a wreck for a couple weeks after that. I did make some pretty good friends in my neighborhood, got to spend Christmas with them, got to spend, New Year's. Well, actually, I didn't spend New Year's with anybody. I was by myself. But Christmas was pretty nice. I got to spend it with them. I am working on a new short story, which I am been updating every week on my Patreon. And I say short story, but it's ended up, now it's over, 25,000 words right now. So it's kind of turning into into more of a novel than a short story. So there's that. So if you want to check out my Patreon, if you like my writing, go for it. I also got a much bigger desk, which is really nice. I've had to move, some equipment out of the way. My poor neglected exercise equipment that is now getting some use finally, after I've gained so much weight. I'm like looking at my face right now going, yeah, those are some fat ass cheeks right there. So, hopefully I'll be losing all of the extra holiday weight, all of the stress weight, all of the shit that happened last year weight, and then get back into my normal routine. And I've got some more equipment on the way too, which will be nice because the weather has been kind of shitty lately. There's just been, unless you're an avid snowboarder or skier, or I don't really know how to ski or snowboard. Eventually I want to learn, but I'm kind of terrified of getting like really hurt and being all by myself with nobody to take care of my dog or take care of me, that sort of thing. So I kind of just stay away from it. I did want to get a fat bike. In fact, I still do, but a lot of other expenses have popped up. I would, for instance, buying new equipment for YouTube kind of took priority over that. So right now I bought one of those, it's like a, I don't know, it's like a small factor, or a small form treadmill that I'm going to put like over here. Just this way I can just, take walks and runs again, because when it's very snowy and icy outside, the last thing you want to do is actually run on the sidewalk. I've actually slipped and fallen on my ass about 3 or 4 times since moving here, and that's not fun. And yeah, I do have nano spikes that you can put on your shoes, but when you're running with those, it's not very comfortable, and it actually hurts your back after a while. So it's not, walking outside in the middle of January at 10,000 feet, it's not fun unless, like I said, you're into winter sports or you've got a fat bike or whatever. Eventually I'm going to get into all that, but this year, probably not going to happen. There's just too much stuff going on right now. So with that out of the way, I wanted to get into today's topic, which is endings. And right now I still don't have a proper teleprompter, so I'm looking at my tablet, which is sitting up on this microphone box. So my eyes are just kind of wander down and then up and then down again. So, it can't be perfect yet. I'm still working on the setup, still getting everything kind of ready. I don't have the lighting up right now because it makes my face look so fucking terrible. I can't even look at myself with that light on. It's just too much. So natural light behind me will just have to do. I've got a question. Have you ever binge watched an incredible show, or read a book that you couldn't put down, watched a movie that had you on the edge of your seat, or just played a video game that drew you in and kept you there, only to get to the end and then find yourself in awe at just how fucking terrible it is? The ending itself destroyed the entire story. It just left you feeling shocked and unfulfilled and kind of furious that you wasted all that precious time you'll never get back, just because the ending sucked that much. I know I've experienced my fair share of bad endings over the years. Some of them are more personal opinions, like my hatred of the mid-2000s Interstellar. I'm sorry, we'll get to that one in a second. Like my hatred of the mid-2000s Battlestar Galactica. That one's kind of controversial because there are people that actually liked the ending. I did not. And of course, the movie Interstellar, which, again, kind of controversial. A lot of people liked it, but also a lot of people fucking hated it. And I'm in the camp that hated the ending. I thought it was a cop-out ending. I thought it was Deus Ex Machina. It was just so nonsensical that I left. It was such a great movie up until that point, and I felt so betrayed by that ending. And other endings were kind of universally hated, like the Game of Thrones, Lost, House, hell, even Roseanne. As beloved as that show was, it just came off the rails and had everyone in America throwing their remote controls at their television sets in unison. So, what makes an ending objectively bad, and what can we as writers learn from them? That's what I'm going to get into today. So let's get the usual introduction out of the way. I'm Aaron Dusk, and I'm an indie author of 2 currently published books and a whole lot of yet-to-be published books once I get around to editing them and rewriting them and doing all the wonderful stuff that will make a book presentable to be sold. If you're looking for that perfect book to start your New Year's resolution off, right, if you want to read a little bit more, if you're looking for like a monster fucking romance novel, then check out The Mark of Amuli or The Varcross Key, or both. I won't tell anyone. So they do objectively have good endings, but there's a slight problem with one of them that I'll get into a little later. Yes, I am going to rake my own writing over the coals, because you don't learn. Nobody is perfect, and you don't learn without making a few mistakes, and I've made quite my share of mistakes, so don't take this video. This video is going to be very snarky. It's going to be kind of rude. That's just who I am in real life. I'm kind of sarcastic. I'm kind of rude. I kind of just tell things like it is. I do have some tact, okay? But just don't take this as like a personal attack if you happen to like these endings, or if you happen to write these types of endings, or if you're just a new author and you're making all of these same mistakes, because newsflash, everybody has. It doesn't matter how good of a writer you are, or how much you think you're going to make these mistakes. You're going to fall into these traps. It's just a matter of time, and you might not even notice it at first, but somebody else will, or you might later on down the road. So in all my years of writing, endings are probably the most challenging part of the drafting process. Yeah, beginnings are difficult in their own way, and I have a video about that as well, but a bad beginning has a major advantage over a bad ending. A reader can spot it early, usually in the sample chapters, and then not buy your book, and in turn, usually won't leave a negative review. In fact, they probably won't at all, because usually people don't leave reviews unless they've read either half or all of the book. I mean, I've left reviews where I've DNF'd at the halfway point before. There's controversy on that as well. A lot of people say that you shouldn't do that, but if you just cannot get through a book because it is so bad, it's so flawed, yeah, I think that's worthy of a review. Again, it could be objective, but usually I don't give reviews where I've DNF'd something at the halfway point unless the book is it's bad, okay? Unless the book is just really bad. But a book with a great beginning, a fantastic middle, and then ends with a dog shit ending is probably going to get you a negative review. In fact, I shouldn't say probably, it will. It definitely will get you a negative review, a scathing negative review. For example, if I invest a week or more into reading a book, and I'm a slow reader, so it takes me a while to get through a book. Sometimes it can take, depending on the length of the book, it can take me a whole month to get through it because I've got other shit I've got to do. So reading in general is a time investment. It is a huge time investment. It's not like sitting down and watching a movie for a couple hours or an hour and a half, or, playing a video game for like an hour or so and then leaving. A book is kind of, you get, I shouldn't put video games in that because it can take a long time to finish a video game. But a book is about the same way, except it's more of like a passive consumption of entertainment, and it takes a long time to get through. And depending on the speed at which you read, since I'm I'm dyslexic, it takes me a long time to actually get through a book, and I'm a very slow reader. So if I've invested a long time in reading a book and it's doing a great job holding my attention, only to then get to the laziest or just downright questionable author choices for an ending, I'm going to be leaving a scathing review. If you're an indie author or writer who thinks this is cruel, ask yourself this question. As a reader, for those of you that do in fact read books, do you like to have your time wasted? That's just a simple question. Do you like to have your time wasted? It's one thing to waste your money or to waste your resources in some way, because those can usually, you can get those back, okay? Time is a finite resource. We've only got a limited amount of time on this planet, and we don't want to be spending that time doing shit that we don't want to do. We already have to do that, usually 8 or 9 or 10 or even more hours a day working or going to school or doing all of this other stuff that we have to do. We don't want our entertainment times, the free time that we have, this short interval of time this precious moments that we have where we're not working, where we're not doing things that we don't want to do, only to then basically have that time wasted by a book or a movie or a show that we thought was really great that ended up just having a complete shit ending, and then you feel like all of that time was wasted. The answer should be a resounding no. If an author has done the work and crafted an amazing world and story, but then cops out when it comes down to tying everything together at the end in a not stupid or lazy way, then I'm sorry, you've written a bad book, in my opinion. I don't care how good the rest of the book is. If you got to the ending and the ending is bad, it's a bad book. That's it. That's all there is to it. Some readers can forgive this if they got some sort of entertainment out of the book itself. But for me, if the ending is bad, the whole book is bad. And I'm going to rate it that way. Okay, I'm going to get a little mean here. Now, some endings are a mixed bag. For example, a lot of people love the way Battlestar Galactica and Interstellar ended. But these are the same people that think every live-action Disney remake is a masterpiece, and their brains are developed just enough to derive enjoyment from anything that amounts to a ring of shiny keys dangling in front of them.
Ready?
That's just my mean-spirited opinion, though, which brings me to this warning for all the writers out there. You may have a great ending that more people enjoyed than didn't like, but some picky assholes like me are going to absolutely hate it. Or they just may feel unfulfilled because the main premise of the story never came to a solid conclusion. I'm going to get into some personal opinions here to start with, and the endings below are not what I would consider objectively bad endings. I just personally don't like them. You may absolutely love them, and that's great. So if you must go into the comment section to face roll over your keyboard, just know that these are my personal opinions, and my opinion is the ending you like probably sucks to me. So one of these endings in particular that I cannot stand are those that leave the reader to come up with their own conclusions. Some people find these endings insightful or artistic. I find them lazy and unfulfilling. Another type of ending I hate is the unbearably tragic ending, where we follow the character through all of these struggles, hoping for something great to pay off, only to have all of those struggles not really matter in the end because everybody fucking dies anyways. So here's where things get a little hazy. I could see two star-crossed lovers dying in their mid-teens in the 1600s because that was kind of the norm back in the day. People were drawn into tragic stories because they were kind of relatable. The world was just miserable in the 16th and 17th centuries, so art kind of reflects the times. And poor Shakespeare, he would die decades before the Enlightenment period, so who knows how his plays or stories would have turned out if he was born a century later. Think about tragic endings now. No one, I should say no one, because that's kind of, I'm putting everybody into my world here, but a lot of us really don't want to see that shit. And now that mental illness won't get you lobotomized in a booby hatch, that is a word you should look up if you don't know. It's not what you think it is. We tend to have a much more positive outlook on life than they used to back in those days. I can just see my fellow millennials and Gen Z rushing to their keyboards to tell me how doomed we all are. But think about it. We actually live in one of the most peaceful and prosperous times in human history. Oh no, the coronavirus shut down society for, I don't know, a year and a half and drove inflation off the walls. Well, just 100 years ago, the Spanish flu killed more people than the Black Death. Just decades ago, the AIDS epidemic even killed more people than the Black Death. And finally, the Black Death killed more people than the Black Death. Okay, and everything shut down because everyone keeping the economy running fucking died. So your fat asses, and let's face it, most of us are a little bit on the wider side now, weren't drafted at 18 to die in mass on the shores of another country. The Great Recession was nowhere near as bad as the Great Depression. So calm your tits. I don't want to hear how bad life is for you, because when looking through shit-colored lenses, no one's ever going to have it worse than you. And since a lot of you out there are kind of the main characters in life, that's really going to be your truth regardless. So back to the topic, tragic endings are, in my opinion, stupid and not needed. If somebody really wants a story or book to completely devastate them, then that just tells me they haven't lived enough yet for life to dick slap them in the most devastating ways imaginable. Congratulations, you've either grown up in privilege or you're just a masochist. And I know some of you tragic ending loving individuals are going to say, well, Aaron, the strength of the story was how they handled adversity up until the end. To which I have to say, yeah, but the main character still died alone in a hospital bed from AIDS. Adversity obviously couldn't be handled or overcome in the end. Janet. Yeah, life doesn't have happy endings, but that's not interesting to me in a work of fiction. I don't care if you like the end of Evangelion, I thought it was stupid. The whole trying to get your message across in a depressing, artsy, edgy way is just going to make me roll my eyes. I was actually watching that movie with someone who liked the ending, and by the time the credits were rolling, he was like, well, what'd you think? Did it make you feel anything? So I didn't really know what to say that wouldn't hurt his feelings, even though I was thinking in my head, yeah, had I been watching this alone, I'd have turned the movie off an hour ago and actually did something entertaining. So, just in case it's not clear, the ending was just a drizzle of diarrhea on a shit Sunday. It was basically Hideaki sharing his clinical depression with the world. Gee, thanks, don't have enough of that already in my life. But enough of my personal opinions. You probably clicked on this video to hear me trash talk the Game of Thrones, and you fell for the clickbait, you dumbass. I'm just kidding, I love you all. Mwah. No, seriously, onto the endings everyone universally hates. So first, let's get into the most obvious and egregious, the unresolved ending. And no, I'm not talking about the ambiguous endings on my personal shit list I mentioned earlier. One of the worst ways to end a story is to get to the end only to realize it's not the end. You've just spent days or weeks reading this story expecting a payoff, only to have that horrible realization that nothing's actually been resolved and there are only a few pages left. There's really no way you can resolve the story in just a few pages. These are books written, usually by indie authors, with the intention of selling a series. But there's a problem. Since these are writers who don't actually read anything but Wattpad stories, they don't seem to understand what a proper book series actually is. Just because a group of books continue a major world plot point doesn't mean each book doesn't bring the current conflicts to a satisfying ending. While the book doesn't necessarily have to stand on its own, there should be a sense of finality. There should be a sense that the main conflict of that particular story arc has been resolved. I'm going to use this again because it was something that I just read or finished reading last year, the year before, the Stormlight Archives, for example, because most fantasy readers have read it, and why not? There is an overarching plot to this series, and it deals with the Desolation, which is this cyclical apocalypse that happens once every 4,000 to 5,000 years. There's also a big baddie, Odium, we're building up to face. Not sure if that's spoilers or not, I'm sure it is. But each book has its own unique story, conflict, and resolution. The first book mainly documents Kaladin's struggles as a slave. He's basically being used as fodder for these wars between nobles and eventually the Parshendi. But at the same time, we're getting to know these other interesting characters, which have their own character arcs and character development. The book actually wraps up Kaladin's arc, as well as bringing to light how he ended up a slave to begin with, and what happened to his younger brother, albeit in one of the worst fucking places for a flashback imaginable, but still. Sanderson's endings are a lot like his books, very drawn out and overwritten, but they bring a sense of completion to the story while setting up the main conflict for the next book. See where I'm going with this? It doesn't just end in the middle of the story's conflict. In order to pick up where it left off in the next book just to sell stuff. If you end a book like that, it's pretty much going to ensure very few people above the ages of 16 are going to read the next book. Why would anyone want to wait a year or two just to find out how the book ended? As an author, I can tell you that you've lost the reader's trust, because now they're probably going to assume that the next book doesn't end either, and probably the book after that. And they would most likely be correct, because the author has proven that they don't know how to write for more than social media platforms. Another example of an unresolved ending is when the main conflict is resolved, but the individual character arcs don't come to any real or satisfying conclusions. Sometimes this is due to the writer just plain forgetting about them. I've been guilty of that myself, but those problems are usually handled in rewrites and revisions, okay? There's really no excuse for this shit. Let's not kid ourselves. Indie books didn't get their reputations for being unedited piles of shit out of nowhere. And sometimes the problem is due to the writer not really thinking that a wrap-up is all that important. But let's say the main character killed someone rather prominent, and the story alludes to that coming back to bite the character in the ass later on. But that never happens, and it's never mentioned again. That can also be considered an unresolved ending. So here's some more spoilers. Stormlight Archives. If you haven't read it yet, go read it. If you don't plan on reading it, or if you've already read it, just continue listening. I'm gonna spoil the story, or at least spoil the first book. Okay, so imagine, if you will, Adolin kills Sadeas, a rather prominent and important high prince of the entire first book, only to have Sanderson never mention it again. Granted, there were times I thought he actually forgot Adolin did that because of how little outward consequences he suffered as a result, but still. It's handled later in the series. It's not at all satisfying, and I think Sanderson wanted to probably take the series in another direction, but changed his mind later on. That can happen too. I've done it myself. Completely understandable. You can't actually go back and write a first book. So back to the issue. You have this major event happen, but it was never properly resolved. Now, sometimes, as I've mentioned before, this can get resolved in the next book if it's a series, but stuff like that is usually foreshadowed throughout the story. You can't just completely drop important events like this, like they never happened, and then never mention them again. So moving on from unresolved endings to number 2, something else I mentioned earlier, the dreaded Deus Ex Machina. For those of you unfamiliar with this piece of shit plot device, let me enlighten you. Say you're a scriptwriter, because that's usually the case, and you've written a script for a Superman movie. And Lois Lane dies horribly in an earthquake caused by Lex Luthor. Well, you know it will tug at the old heartstrings, but Lois Lane is kind of an important character to the franchise and the actual hero. So to kill her off would alter the source material. So how do you actually go about fixing that? Well, the obvious answer to people getting paid to write this shit is to have Superman fly really, really fast around the Earth in the opposite direction, thereby causing the Earth to rotate backwards, thereby reversing time. You're probably thinking, that's idiotic. Well, that's because it is. And it actually happened for those of you unfamiliar with the 1978 version of Superman. I remember watching that movie as a kid, and as a kid thinking, that's stupid. How did that even happen? That seemed awfully random and convenient. So to clarify, Superman didn't just fly faster than the speed of light and somehow rip the fabric of space and time like the Speed Demon episode of the Powerpuff Girls, which, if you haven't seen that, I mean, this kind of makes sense because it's kind of like a similar thing that happens here. No, he just simply flies around the Earth until it rotates backwards, therefore causing time itself to go backwards as well. This is probably hands down one of the laziest and most what the fuck resolutions to a conflict that stayed with me for literal decades, okay? If you want your book to be remembered for all the wrong reasons, write an ending like this. This is a prime example of a Deus Ex Machina. It's a sudden resolution to a seemingly unsolvable problem, and in this case it's Lex Luthor unleashing a doomsday device and Lois Lane eventually biting the big one, and it's resolved by some random and unlikely or unexpected occurrence, Superman being able to turn back time by reversing the Earth's rotation. Now, to harp on the science aspect of this a little more, because why not? I don't think that's actually what would happen if the Earth just suddenly stopped and rotated in the opposite direction. You're talking about slowing the Earth from rotating at 1,000 miles per hour to nothing and then reversing it. Imagine the feeling of slamming on the brakes of a car going 1,000 miles per hour, but the car hits a concrete wall. People, buildings, entire continents, large bodies of water, everything on this planet will be feeling the effects of Newton's first law to a world-ending extreme. But I digress. Another probably better known Deus Ex Machina would be Aslan from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series. Yes, Jesus Lion dies for our sins, comes back from the dead, and kills the White Witch. Deep and profound, I must say. Oh yeah, spoilers to anyone who hasn't read a book published over 7 decades ago. Now, why is Jesus Lion considered a Deus Ex Machina? Because he's kind of like a much more overpowered version of Gandalf in a way. Because he appears at very crucial moments throughout the series and resolves issues the author in no way had the writing ability to resolve outside of divine intervention. It truly is a tale as old as time, and when you trust that an almighty God will solve all of your problems for you if you wish upon a star hard enough, it's easy to let that shit kind of slip into your writing. And if it's not already abundantly clear, I'm not much of a churchgoer these days. Number 3, the out of left field resolution with absolutely no lead up to it in the entire story ending. It's similar to the Deus Ex Machina, but this just happens because the writer thought it was cool to subvert our expectations somehow. Well, there's a difference between subverting our expectations in ways that make sense, and then there's this bullshit. Imagine, if you will, that you spent 5 seasons building each protagonist and antagonist foundation, each one being shaped by the events of years of conflict, tragedy, turmoil, betrayal, and incest. Lots and lots of incest. Only to then completely dismantle that foundation in just 2 seasons, the results of which bring about the conclusion to the overarching world-ending conflict in the most limp-dicked way imaginable, while also turning one of the most beloved characters into a genocidal maniac with absolutely no lead-up or reason. I don't know, maybe every woman with power either ends up an evil queen or Hitler, which of course hasn't been browbeaten into us enough, but to do that with a genuinely good character, it's like if Sansa were to be the one to slit Littlefinger's throat instead of Arya. It would end up being kind of funny because it would be so out of character. She's the type of princess that has other people do her killing for her as she watches. This is pretty much how the Daenerys arc ended. She wasn't under some kind of spell, she was just kind of angry. But if you think about all of the things that she'd been through in her life, she would have turned into a genocidal maniac a lot earlier on. Now, granted, she did kind of kill a lot of nobles and stuff, but she killed a lot of nobles, people who actually deserved to die. And yes, I know that that can lead to a slippery slope. The French Revolution wasn't all sunshine and roses. A lot of innocent people died, but it just seemed like Daenerys had a lot of checks and balances, you know, to keep her kind of grounded, to keep her kind of focused and not go off on a basically murderous rampage where she's killing a lot of innocent people that she once, you know, swore and vowed that she would be saving or liberating. Yet that's kind of what we got. It would have made more sense to have it led up a little bit more than it was. It just sort of seemed just jammed in there, and it just came out of left field, and a lot of people just didn't like it. Maybe it was an objectively good ending, and I say that kind of holding down a little bit of vomit. This type of ending doesn't just disappoint, it makes people angry. And it doesn't just make people angry by design either. The people who greenlit this crap probably thought that everyone was going to just love this shit. They were just going to eat it up. But instead, it had everyone questioning what kind of nepotism or Harvey Weinstein-esque sexual favors were exchanged in order for these complete hacks to get jobs as directors and scriptwriters for such a successful series. It makes people never want to watch or read another thing in that universe. And it did that for me, because I'm never going to be reading or watching another thing in this universe again. And this is the case for authors. It can make a reader never want to touch another book you write. I'll give another example of this, although this is not like a universally this is not a universal thing. This is kind of like a personal thing, because I tend to give authors a little more than one book before I completely write them off altogether, unless their writing is just objectively horrible, okay? I'll give an example of TJ Klune. TJ Klune, his Wolfsong series, as you guys know, I absolutely fucking hated. I hated that book. I didn't read any other books. I got to the halfway point, I think, in the first Wolfsong book, and was like, I'm done with this bullshit. I can't read this anymore. I'm very picky when it comes to werewolves in general, but this had me this had me very upset. So I put the book down, didn't pick it back up again, and then somebody recommended his book In the Life of Puppets, which I was like, it didn't really seem like, a Pinocchio retelling didn't seem like something that I would be interested in reading. But then when I read the actual synopsis of it, I'm like, okay, that sounds kind of interesting, and his writing wasn't awful. Like, TJ Klune, he can write good prose. So I'm like, okay, let me try that book, see how it is, and ended up really liking that book. I ended up, the ending was a little weak, but all in all, I felt very satisfied when I got to the end of that book. And I thought it was a very cute book. It had its very serious moments, but for the most part, it seemed kind of whimsical in a way, especially with the robot characters like Nurse Ratched and what was his name? The vacuum cleaner. Oh fuck, what was his name? He was just very, very funny. The vacuum cleaner was very funny. He was kind of like the stupid comic relief in a way. And yeah, there were times when he came off kind of annoying, but Klune didn't overdo it. And there was also kind of a nod to the Wolfsong series, which kudos to Klune for putting that in, because there was a moment where the vacuum was like something about candy cane or something about pine cones being awesome, and I was like, okay, so he did get a lot of flack for that, understandably, in the Wolfsong series, and he actually made a nod to that in the book, because it was kind of a cringy thing in the first book, and he brought it back and actually made it funny. So kudos to Klune, really liked that. That was fun. So back on topic, when you spend an entire book or series building up to what should be an amazing finale that leaves everybody satisfied, only to then have an ending jump the fucking shark and go its own way, disregarding the very foundation in order to artistically throw us all for a creative loop, you're not coming across as some kind of genius, believe me. All you've really done is destroy both the story and the trust of anyone who is enjoying it. And congratulations, you look like a complete idiot in the process. This next ending, most of you will probably agree, some will disagree, is something that will completely tank a series or a story, and it's number 4, the "it was all just a dream" ending. There are a lot of examples of this across many different media, but I'm going to bring back one of the sensations that took the nation by storm in the late 80s to late 90s, Roseanne. As a kid, and even as an adult, I loved this show. Outside of the Golden Girls, it was one of the most memorable and beloved sitcoms of our time. The Connors were the quintessential working class family in the Rust Belt during this time. If you didn't grow up upper middle class or rich, which was most of us, this was probably the most relatable show out there. And I don't care how insane you think she is, the Connors was nothing without Roseanne. Sorry. The way she and John Goodman played off of one another, the chemistry and real-life conflict we got to see, was an example of not only brilliant screenwriting, but brilliant casting in general. My 2 favorite characters were, of course, Darlene and Jackie in the earlier seasons, just hands down. Darlene grew up from being this sarcastic little tomboy to this angsty, sarcastic teenager who, as dark as she pretended to be, ended up growing as a character in her later teenage years. But then something happened around the season 6 mark that took the show spiraling into something that would become increasingly over the top and unrecognizable. The moment Darlene goes off to college, things start feeling a bit like Desperate Housewives in a way. The characters make these stupid decisions. Darlene and Jackie become increasingly unlikable and insufferable. And then the moment that really throws things into chaos was Darlene's wedding. And for those of you that have seen the show, you remember Darlene's wedding. It was kind of the season finale of the time, and it was like, uh-oh, are they, I hope that they're not doing what I think that they're doing. Dan has a heart attack, but lives, thankfully. But Unfortunately, the story starts to come off the rails more and more until the Connors, this once beloved working class family, wins the lottery. And you would think at this point, because of how kind of insane and weird the series is getting at this point, perhaps that in itself was foreshadowing in a way, but I don't like this. I did not like this in any way whatsoever. Even with the foreshadowing, the ending was... We'll get to that in a second. I'll be completely honest. I don't remember much between Darlene's wedding and anything after this because I was just watching the show because I'd been invested in it for years. One of the most memorable moments of this era was when Dan leaves Roseanne and she just drives around in her Mercedes to every last fast food restaurant joint in town and just binge eats. Been there, done that, honey. I just didn't do that in a luxury car. It just didn't feel like Roseanne anymore. The constant playoff of one another, both serious and funny, was completely lost once Dan and Roseanne split. And it wasn't fun to watch these particular people spiral. This is what happens when you don't end a show where it's supposed to end. In The Golden Girls, B. Arthur was 100% correct in her decision to stop after season 7. The show was absolutely perfect, so it should have a perfect ending and it never should be revisited again. Thank you for being a friend. I fucking hate Hollywood. So we go through 10 seasons spanning almost an entire decade only to get to the last episode. Everyone older than 33 remembers this episode. It ends with Roseanne sitting in her basement behind a typewriter, writing the events of her life in the way she would have preferred. So it was Jackie and not her mother that was the muff bumper. Dan actually did die of the heart attack during Darlene's wedding, and Darlene married Mark instead of Mark marrying Becky, and they never won the lottery. It was all in Roseanne's imagination. It was almost as though symbolically Roseanne took on the sins of every shit hack writer from episode 7 onward, carrying that cross up Golgotha to be crucified. She later would make an invisible cameo in the train wreck known as The Connors when we learn she dies of an opioid overdose, and the ending of the ending never actually happened. It was true all along. Again, I fucking hate Hollywood. So Through the Looking Glass, or Alice in Wonderland, is another prime example of this type of ending, as well as The Beloved Wizard of Oz. Only these stories have completely different effects on the reader by the end of the book. In The Wizard of Oz, the dream sequence actually has a point. Dorothy becomes more appreciative of her family and the relative comfort of the life she lives in, or the life she leads in rural Kansas. On the contrary, in Alice in Wonderland, the only thing we're treated to is Alice ranting like a lunatic to her sister, who then goes on to have a daydream of Alice's dream. It's stupid and I hate it, but it was a product of the 1800s, so I'll forgive it. If you could read back in those days, it was really the only form of entertainment, and story writing was still in its kind of pre-teens at this point. Another type of ending that's an offshoot of the "it was all a dream" is the back to the beginning ending. The ones that are especially egregious are the ones that it's implied it's a dream, but there's something on the character's desk or bed or in the character's life that may imply that the story never took place at all. Think of that Uncanny Valley Tom Hanks movie, The Polar Express, and The Slave Bell, for example. This also ties into that ambiguous ending I hate as well. Some people might like these endings, but for the most part, they've kind of fallen out of popularity for good reason. Moving on. Number 5, the no character growth ending. If I were rating these endings on a tier list, this would be right down there with the unresolved ending. Usually in traditionally published books, developmental editors will catch this if the manuscript even makes it past the agent, but normally you see these types of endings in author insert fanfiction, Wattpad stories, and yes, even self-published books that people end up paying real money for. One of the most unsatisfying things you can experience when consuming media is when the main character and the supporting characters are the exact same people by the end of the story as they were at the start. This means that the story had absolutely no reason to exist. There was no growth or learning experience for the character, which means that there was likely no real or high stakes conflict throughout the entire story. Badass Mary Sue character can do no wrong and is absolutely perfect in every way, confronts every issue exactly the same way, and resolves them effortlessly, usually coming up with the right solutions for the right problems at the right time. Or there may not be any point or conflict to the story at all, as it details the life of a vapid 21-year-old Cassandra who fucks every guy and treats her friends like shit. But the author ends up making this rotten cunt of a character smell like a spring rain by the end. It's boring, and thankfully the bad writing on the wall is made apparent well before anyone reaches the end. These are the types of stories people usually stop reading after the second paragraph. These are stories you expect from first-time writers who are experimenting with characterization and world building. They know it's absolute dog shit, but it's vital to the learning process that they write it. But when a writer who should know better ends up taking a steaming dump on their keyboard and then proceeds to push the result of that up to KDP, that's a problem. So with all of that out of the way, what can we learn from all of these bad endings? Well, for one, you want to make sure that your story actually ends and that your book can stand by itself, even if it's part of a series. Now, books that end on cliffhangers are okay if the main plot of that particular book has been resolved in some way. I love books that hint at another possible story in the future, as long as I'm not left with unanswered questions that should have been answered in the last 400 pages at some point. As a lot of you out there watching me know, I write these types of endings all the time, resolving the story while hinting at a sequel or a continuation of the story in the future. The epilogue in the Mark of Amuli does this. The Varcross Key resolves the main conflict of the antagonist, but hints that there may be something much bigger on the horizon. For number 2 crap ending, if the story can't be resolved in an expected way that makes sense, don't take the character's agency out of the equation and magically make everything better by some divine intervention or convenient and convoluted plot device. You may need to use your brain a little more, or you might have to do a lot of rewriting just to get your characters out of the hole you put them in. So I'm going to throw some praise to the plotters out there. Doing this is much easier when you plan your story, and you just have to tweak the outline of the story to make it make sense. It becomes much harder when you're a pantser. There are times when I write my characters into seemingly unsolvable situations, and if I don't want to rewrite everything, I have to sit down and think about a few things. How has my character handled conflict up to this point? How does the world work? Are there fantasy elements? Are there supernatural elements? Is everything just grounded in reality? What is preventing the main character from getting out of the situation I put them in? And how do I allow the character to figure it out using the elements already established in the world that actually make sense to that world? If your only answer is to have a giant eagle swoop down and carry your main character out of danger when the story would have ended much earlier if that option was selected after another main character was saved in the exact same way at the start, it's probably not going to be a very satisfying ending. Yes, I just ripped on the Lord of the Rings. Fight me. Number 3, the ending needs to make sense. There needs to be enough foreshadowing and character development for a twist ending to make the reader go, aha, instead of... If your ending ends up contradicting everything you've built up without subtle warnings throughout the story, it doesn't come across as brilliant or twisty. It tells the reader that the author just pulled everything from his or her ass in order to seem smart. Sometimes a writer might not notice it, but you know who will notice it? Critique partners and beta readers. Get them, utilize them. Number 4, if your story just ends up back at the beginning and it was all just a dream without the character having really learned anything, then the story probably really had no point to begin with. Or at least that's what the reader is likely going to think. What was the point of hours of character development and conflict only to realize none of it actually happened? If you do this, you're going to have more than a few readers pissed off at you. That much is guaranteed. And finally, number 5, have your characters grow and be completely changed by the ending in some way. We just had the holidays pass by, and I know A lot of you out there watch The Christmas Carol in some form or another. Muppets Christmas Carol was the best, and I don't care what anybody says. This is the best example of character growth in the history of literature. Your characters should have their morals and beliefs challenged by the events that take place in your story. Growth brings life and additional dimensions to your characters, and it brings about a very satisfying conclusion when it all comes together. If your character learned absolutely nothing or isn't changed in some way, it's probably going to not be very well received. Another example of this would be like a villain's or a fallen hero's origin story. This is character growth, but kind of in the other direction. You can also have the main character of a series gradually fall into evil based on how he or she handled the events and conflicts in his or her life. It doesn't matter the direction or degree the character changes, as long as the story changed them in some way. And I'm going to be a little controversial and biased here. This is kind of why older authors tend to write better characters than younger authors do. We've had time to change and grow, and we've had a lot more happen to us that changed our opinions and challenged our beliefs up until now. We can look back at our younger selves and understand the events that led us to where we are, and know that we're not the same person nowadays that we were, a decade ago. Character development needs to mimic life. Even if you're a younger author, you're not the same person in your 20s that you were in your teens. And if you are, it's probably going to show in your writing, because you will end up writing an ending in characters like this. As far as life goes, you're still at the beginning of the story yourself. So this video ended up being incredibly long, and now that I've gotten most of you upset with me, I'll make this pretty clear right now. I don't care. If you love writing shitty, unsatisfying endings, then write to your little heart's content. Just don't expect a whole lot of positive feedback, if you even bother to get that far. How you end your story, especially if it's a really good story, is really important. You have to land it. It has to have such an impact on your reader that they just keep thinking about it for weeks after they're done. Whether it's a sad ending or a happy one, if the reader finished and was satisfied, they're going to tell you, and they're going to tell you a lot. And they will likely send you direct messages or send you emails or whatever, telling you how much they enjoyed their story, as well as reviewing it very well. If you wrote an unsatisfying ending, they're going to also tell you. Indirectly, though. That's going to be a long Goodreads review with all the animated GIFs and frustration the reader can muster to go along with it. So I did mention earlier that I was going to rake myself over the coals, because no one is immune to writing a bad or subpar ending. No matter how good of a writer I think I am, there's always going to be something that humbles me or has me questioning if I need to rethink my process or challenge what I thought to be right. So let's just rip off the band-aid and get into the Mark of Amuli. There will be light spoilers, so if you've already read it or don't plan on reading it, feel free to keep listening. The end of the Mark of Amuli was really a product of time and cost, and kind of something I regret. There was so much more I wanted to explore with that, especially after the climax of the story. And even the climax of the story was resolved in one chapter, which was, when I go back and read it, unsatisfying. So I knew it at the time, and yes, the readers knew it as well. I've read a few reviews that have pointed that out. Even if they rated the book high and were satisfied with the ending, they still commented on this. And let's just say it was a very humbling experience. It was the moment between the climax and the next chapter, which was a huge time skip that bothered a lot of people. And yes, it did bother me too. And when I go back and read it again, I still kick myself every single time that I get to that point in the book. For a first book, it had some first book problems, but it also circumvented a lot of problems most bad books have, okay? I still managed to tell a good story that obviously a lot of people loved. But the way it ending from climax to resolution left a lot of people feeling kind of unsatisfied. So taking the lessons I learned from the Mark of Amuli, I applied that to the Varcross Key and to all of the other stories I've completed since then. The Mark of Amuli was a good first book, but it was also a flawed first book, and it was a lesson on the importance of a satisfying ending. So with that out of the way, feel free to buy my books and see if I landed the ending or if they were just giant turds to you. Also, if you got something out of this video, be it a learning experience or blind rage, feel free to comment below. YouTube loves it whether you're hating it or not. So until next time.